Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to a deck breakdown for Druid Beatdown and Warrior Legendaries, the third and fourth most popular deck from my top 10. Now, there was supposed to be Paladin Giants on this video, however, the Giants sort of variant of it has died off in favor of just straight Paladin. And if it becomes popular, and if it does well in tournaments, I'll do a weekly show topic on it at some point. But as for now, it's not really worth talking about because it's just a suboptimal version of the normal deck. Anyway, so first of all, we're going to talk about Druid Beatdown, which is still the winningest, I guess you could call it, deck of the format. Still. Post-patch did pretty much nothing. It still won the most tournaments, still got the most finals. It's won 5 EU tournaments in a row now, I don't know. It was double finals for Druid in both the Swiss and the Open this weekend. It was crazy. Druid is everywhere. Do not underestimate Druid. If you do, it's at your own peril. It's still the best deck in the format, still winning most of the tournaments being played, especially on EU. On NA, it wins every so often, but it still wins more than some of the other classes do, that's for sure. But on EU, it's just the top tier, and it's very difficult to beat. So moving on to some of the essential cards. Now, there isn't really an engine that powers this deck, so to speak. It's more of a series of cards itself. So we'll start with two of the main Druid cards and two of the main reasons to play a deck. Keeper of the Grove, which is the single-handed best silence in the game. You just silence minion with a 2/4 body, or if silence is dead, then just do 2 damage. Holy Smite. Holy Smite or Arcane Shot on a minion. It's incredibly powerful. Either one of those abilities would be good enough for it to see some play, but the fact that it has access to both is just nuts. Now the other card here is Ancient of Lore, which has a 5/5 body, which is very relevant, especially if you innervate it out. But the choose one is one of the most powerful in the game. Draw 2 cards on a 5/5 is not to be underestimated. Arcane Intellect is a very underestimated effect, and considering you're paying about 2 mana from the 5 mana 5/5 for your draw 2, it's very, very worth it. Especially if you innervate into it, you invest 2 cards, get 2 cards out, you just cycle through and you get a 5/5. You also get to see some more cards. The other one is Restore 5 Health. Now this works against hunters, it works in stall matches, you can use it on big stuff that they haven't quite killed in one turn. It's just an incredible card overall, and I would recommend 2 of in pretty much every single Druid deck. Some of the other essential cards, we have Druid of the Claw. This will almost never get charged, but the fact that it can get charged is notable. The main function of Druid of the Claw is the +2 health and taunt. Now, a 4/6 with taunt for 5 is incredibly difficult to deal with, especially on turn 3. Rogues will have to backstab eviscerate it. Warriors have to combo and execute with it. Warlocks can't Siphon Soul it yet, they have to Soulfire or Shadowbolt plus attack. It's just incredible at trading, will get you a bunch of early board advantage, which is all the card really needs to do. The other one here, which shows up pretty much everything, is Blood Mage Thalnos. Spell damage, draw power. I've talked about Blood Mage to death, so I'm just not going to. It's in pretty much every single deck. If you don't know why the card is good, it's a loot hoarder that makes your spells stronger. Just think about that. Now, the last minion I'm going to talk about for the essential cards is Harvest Golem. Harvest Golem, sometimes it's not played, but in most situations it is. Now the main reason for this is the fact that it stops aggro, it sets an early board position, it's difficult to deal with without 2-for-1ing yourself if you're not a Druid, for example, with Wrath and Hero Power or Mage. So it's just sturdy. It just is sturdy. If you innervate it out, you can get it on turn 1, and that's almost impossible to handle, especially for these aggro decks. It's just an aggro stop. It's not bad. It's not that bad late game because you can buff it up, or you can just sort of top deck it, play it, and it will survive an AoE. And it's just a solid 3-drop. A very, very good 3-drop. More of a utility card as opposed to an offensive card, even though it doesn't have a utility ability. It just trades a bunch and gets you card advantage in this manner. Now, Innervate is arguably the most powerful card in the game that actually gives you card disadvantage. So what do I mean by that? Innervate does not give you a card. what it does is it gets something large out sooner. So you're effectively using a card up at 0 cost to get something out sooner. It means you invest an extra card in it. The deck can get away with this because it has a lot of draw power from things like Ancient Lores and cantrips, but most importantly, your opponent probably has to put 2-3 cards into killing, say, a Druid of the Claw on turn 3, as opposed to maybe 1 card on turn 6, say Black Knight for example. The fact that you innovated out, you invested another card in, but your opponent has to invest more cards into it because removal is more stingy at that point of the game. You have some cheap removal, damage based usually, and you don't have access to these big taunt removers that you have late game. Innervate, arguably one of the best cards in the deck. Now, onto the essential spells, besides Innervate. Yeah, along with Innervate, these 3 function as the entire spell list for these kinds of decks nowadays. Wrath, Swipe, Innervate, 2 ofs, you're done. Wrath is one of the most versatile 2 for 3 damage removal spells in the game. Why? Because it's a shiv that you can use on your own minions even if you need to cycle. You can take down something with 2 health for 4 mana with Wrath and Hero Power. And with spell damage, the cycling effect gets crazy. Doing 2-3 damage with a cycled Wrath is pretty nuts. And the 3 damage deals with any early aggro you need to. It's just solid, it's not sort of amazingly flashy, but it does a job and it does it well. Now, on the contrary, Swipe is incredibly flashy. It deals with any AoE needs you have. If you have a Blood Mage on the board, it turns into a Starfall without having to choose in between the effects. That also affects the enemy hero. Yeah, that's crazy. Swipe is arguably one of the best removal spells in the entire game, and is one of the reasons why Druid has next to no issues with a lot of the major threats in the metagame. Things like some of the legendaries that have 5 health, you can ping off with a hero power and a swipe. You can deal with things like Azure Drake in one go, Harvest Golems, SI7s, any tokens from Paladins, which deals with all of them, Totems if you have spell power. It's just an incredible removal spell. It deals with pretty much anything it needs to, and can even help you take down some really, really large stuff, because 4 damage is a sweet spot. If you get 2 swipes, you can kill a Ragnaros, for example. Same logic with Eviscerate. So, onto the skeleton list. Now, the skeleton list for Druid is very structured. We have Blood Mage Thalnos, as I said before. But some of the other things we have in here are things like Nat Pagal has come up recently. It's just a draw engine. Tankmaster and Black Knight. Now, it's a little bit of a mistake on my part. I should have probably put Tankmaster here and then left Black Knight as a tech, because a lot of most of these decks run it, but it's not in every Druid deck. It's not sort of a necessity. So I'll talk about the Black Knight a bit later. But yeah, Tankmaster I would say is essential because Druid has no hard removal. Black Knight is debatable. Ancient Allure, 2 of, Defender, buffs up your things like Harvest Golem, Keeper, all essentials with Druid Claw, Harvest Golem. Loot Hoarder is something I've noticed a lot recently with Nat Pagal and Blood Mage, giving you just enough draw power for your late game, and then once you get to late game, you just cycle through your Ancient of Lures and just get as many cards as you need. Now, as far as the actual spells goes, you play 6. You can throw in a Claw maybe a Starfall, but most of the time you just play 6. This is just to prevent you from ever drawing bad hands. If you have that few spells in your deck, you can't really draw bad hands because Innervate cycles out anything large. You need some seriously large creatures in your hand to get a bad hand. So anyway, that skeleton list leaves you with 8 free, or technically 9 if you take away the Black Knight. So what kind of techs can you run with those 8? I already mentioned Claw and Starfall as examples. There's also Earthen Ring Farce here, as far as sort of the basics and commons goes. However, first possible techs, Black Knight and Sylvanas. Now, these are techs in pretty much every deck. You will see them in my possible tech section for every single deck I probably will ever do, because Black Knight is super good against taunts. I mean, look at its ability. It's an Assassinate on a 4/5 that only targets taunts, which is one of the reasons why Ancient of War isn't played in the skeleton list anymore. Black Knight really does screw over Ancient of War plays, and you waste your entire turn and then it gets Black Knighted. Even if you innovate it out, if your opponent went first and they still Black Knight it, it's just messy. It's just nasty. You don't want to face a Black Knight and give it a bunch of targets. It's one of the reasons why it's here as well and not essential, where sometimes it hits nothing, but even decks that don't focus on taunt play Defender of Argus. It deals with things like shields up Warlock decks incredibly efficiently. It kills Druid of Claws. Anything that gets buffed with taunt in general by Defender or Sunfury. And to be honest, that's roughly it. Like, those are the main targets. You've got Defender of Argus targets, specifically with Giants. You've got Druid of the Claw, and arguably Ancient of Wars, although not many people have been playing Ancient of Wars. It doesn't seem like a very large sort of section to go for, but when you consider the fact that some people just run random stuff like Sunwalkers, and Black Knight is one of the most efficient ways of killing a Sunwalker in the game, it does add up. Having just one, especially when you have access to pretty much no hard removal, is pretty much essential. If your opponent gives taunt to something large because they think it will give them an advantage, suddenly your Black Knight becomes live and you deal with it. It's also a 4-5 if you know they're not playing any taunts. Sylvanas got slowed down a bit. It still does the same as it always used to, which is being a 5-5 that steals your opponent's stuff. It's still good. It will still always be good at that cost. Debatable whether or not you play it, but it's still pretty decent. Now, onto the super late game stuff. Ysera and Ragnaros. One ends the game if it doesn't die, and the other one ends the game if it doesn't die. So the first one is Ysera. Ysera doesn't do much when it hits the board. It gives your opponent a turn, but the dream cards are insane. You just end the game with a 4-12. If they can't deal with it with hard removal, they're not going to. 12 health is way too much. They're just going to go straight for you. If you have a decent health buffer when you play Ysera, you just power through with your dream cards and just win the game on its own. It's an incredibly powerful late game tech. The other one is Ragnaros, which will generally remove something when you play it, and then will remove 2 cards from their hand when they kill it. That's a 3-for-1, by the way. And sometimes they don't have the way of killing Ragnaros. You'd be surprised, though sometimes it gets in 2 shots and just kills them because it's 16 damage. It ends games very fast. Ragnaros is one of the strongest game enders in the game. Now, before I move on to the last one, which is a bit of a controversial tech, and some people run it, some people think it's kind of meh. I'm going to talk about Karen, which I forgot to put up on the slides. But Karen Bloodhoof is incredibly powerful in this kind of deck. The only reason the effect is obviously insanely powerful. The problem with the card is it's slow, but if you innovate it out, it's almost a good game. So I would definitely recommend putting Karen in these kinds of decks, especially if you're running fewer innovate targets, so you can always innovate out your Karen as opposed to having to save it for Ysera or Ragnaros. Just a random thing to throw in there. Now on to the last one, Cenarius. Now, Cenarius is either hated or loved, depending on which Druid player you ask. That's why it's on its own sort of section here. Now, the first effect is why some people really like it. The second effect is why some people don't like it. It's kind of funny if you think about it that way. So what does the first effect do? It gives everything on your board +2/+2 and gives you a 5/8. Okay. They're now dead. This is something which will just end the game straight away if you play it and get the buffs off on 2, 3 minions. If you get a buff off on a Druid of the Claw, yeah, that's a 6/8 with taunt. Good luck with that. Even an Ancient Allure becomes a 7/7. This stuff is like really game ending if you get buffs on a couple of really large minions. That's the upside. What's the downside? It's not really much of a downside as opposed to just a lack of power. Where if you have to play Cenarius blank, you summon it with 2/2/2 treants and a 5/8. The problem is that sometimes they just kill the treants and then kill you. Because if you have to play the 2/2 treants, it means you're probably behind. Or you're in top deck mode. Top deck mode doesn't happen too often in Constructed nowadays, so mostly you're behind if you have to play the treants. And that's where Cenarius sort of falls short. If you can stay ahead, Cenarius will just win the game out of nowhere. He's kind of like a Bloodlust. If you're ahead, he will end the game and end a stalemate. If you're behind, he's kind of meh. However, I would definitely test the card if you have it. Definitely test with it. It's a very powerful 9-drop. interchangeable with Ysera mainly. Some people play both, but they come under the same slot. It's a very interesting tech you can run. So anyway, on to the second deck, Warrior Legendaries. Now, this is a deck which a lot of people don't know about, and the main reason is the deck is so expensive to make that very few people play it. The deck, however, is incredibly powerful. Christopher took this to a finals of a Swiss tournament, and he just swept the entire tournament, like almost flawlessly. He lost one game in the entire tournament. And Dark Onyx has also been running this deck a bit on ladder, and that's been dealing with a lot of really powerful decks like Warlock, Shields Up, Druids. It's just been a very powerful deck, and it's not that well publicized. However, I do think the deck is incredibly strong, and we'll get into it. It's sort of a control deck that features, instead of a couple of win conditions, it just slams legendaries until it wins. That's literally how the deck works. So anyway, on some of the essential cards. Blood Mage and Wild Pyromancer. The main reason these are both together is because they both power up your spells, and you have a lot of cheap spells in this deck, and often you really do need these triggers to help you out with your spells. Whirlwind gets massive bonuses of Blood Mage, Wild Pyromancer gets huge bonuses of things like Slam and Execute and things like that. It's just, they're both kind of essential, because Wild Pyromancer, while hurting your own board, your stuff is large enough to take the hits, but it has several advantages. Primarily, it can enrage things. It can deal with things like Divine Shield far better than Blood Mage can, and it affects more spells. However, it doesn't draw a card, and it's not sort of universally a bonus to your spells. Sometimes it can hurt your own board. But yeah, they're both essential. They're both here, both ways of powering up your spells. Now, moving on to the next one, we've got Acolyte of Pain and Execute. Acolyte of Pain actually synergizes very well with Execute, funnily enough, but it just draws a lot of cards. You can inner rage it, draw a card, get a 3/2, and then when they remove it, you draw another card, and they might take some damage from a hero power or trade with a minion, and you just cycled 2 cards, and they lost 1. So it's a very efficient trading card. Now, on other notes, sometimes your opponent will ignore this, and you get 3 activations. If you get 3 activations out of an Acolyte of Pain, consider yourself incredibly far ahead. Normally, this draws probably 1.5 cards on average, between 1 and 2. Rarely will it draw 3, but sometimes it definitely does. Also, against Paladins, this will ensure that you make their early game a living nightmare, especially if they are playing control, because their first couple turns will just be tokens. You play Acolyte, and they want to kill you. It's one of the best techs against Paladin in particular, but it's just a solid draw engine. Execute is Warrior hard removal, and is essential. I would definitely play an Execute, I'll put it that way. You just damage it with something like Whirlwind, Wild Pyromancer trigger, Acolyte of Pain running into and drawing a card, and then just execute it, get that Giant off the board, get that Ragnaros off the board, Ysera, gone. So why Execute is so good. Now onto a little combination. Shield Block is healing, which functions very, very well against these Hunter decks and aggro decks. Also draws you a card, gets you further into your deck. And Shield Slam, normally with hero power, would do 2 damage, or possibly 4. With Shield Block, it's a 1 mana deal 5. Yeah, 1 mana deal 5 in a 2-card combo that's 4 mana, but one of them replaces itself. And if you add a hero power onto that, you deal 7. It's a lot. Shield Slam can hit very high numbers at times. I've seen Shield Slams of 10, 12 against other control decks, because you just armor up every turn. They can't pressure you. So you start using Shield Slam as Ysera removal and Ragnaros removal and things like Cairn and such. And it's incredible how high the damage on Shield Slam can reach if you take the time to set up for it. Very essential card. Now the last thing is the 2, in my mind, compulsory win conditions. You've got Ragnaros, which, while being vulnerable to Big Game Hunter, just does a ton of damage, but you can't direct it. And then you have Grom, where if you have an inner rage, it deals 12. That's a lot of damage that is very difficult to mitigate without something like Taunt. So those are the 2 obligatory win conditions. Ragnaros is so noticeable, actually, that a lot of people are running main deck Big Game Hunters just to deal with Ragnaros. There's literally no other targets in most decks apart from Ragnaros for Big Game Hunter. It's the Ragnaros killer. Grom is more of an obscure one, but it definitely deals much more damage when it comes to single target direct to the face as a finisher. Anyway, moving on to the skeleton list. We'll start with the spells. We've got Brawl is essential as a one-off. You really need a Brawl to deal with some of these large boards because you don't play that many minions. Shield Slams, Inner Rages, synergize well while Pyromancers, and Shield Slam can get up to a lot of damage. Slams draws through your deck. Cleave deals with aggro decks. Same with Whirlwind and Executes. Now these numbers are sort of variable. Unlike with the Druid deck, you can vary the numbers you are playing here depending on your playstyle and what you feel like you actually need. Now as far as the actual minions goes, you'll notice there's a lack of legendaries in the legendary deck. Oh no, they're coming up. Most of them attacks. You've got Cairn, Deathwing. Wait a sec. Yeah, Deathwing is the I'm out of cards, I'm going to kill you card. Now, from watching people play the deck, Deathwing tends to come down when they have used all their hard removal, so all the Siphon Souls, Big Game Hunters, Tink Monsters, anything. And then your last card in your deck is Deathwing. And because you're so high on armor, you actually win the Fatigue War, and you just kill your opponent with the Deathwing. Like, that's all it is. It's a win button when you're both out of cards, and they have no answers to that in any way. Very underestimated card, but in this kind of control deck, it definitely works. And then you have Grom and Ragnaros, as I already mentioned. And lastly, as far as skeleton list goes, we have the two weapons, Fiery War Axe. Now, Fiery War Axe can be sort of... It's not always in these decks, but I would definitely recommend it. It's one of the best weapons in the game. 3/2 for 2 mana weapon, deals with 2 threats. It can help deal with things like Harvest Golem without 2-for-1ing yourself, Earthen Ring Farseers, Flame Imps, anything. It just deals with any early minions that you really don't want to deal with. And when you're armoring up every single turn, it doesn't tend to damage you that much. But anyway, so that leaves us with 6 to 10 cards free. Now, onto some of the legendaries. Black Knight and Sylvanas I already talked about, but they are definitely worth sort of noting that they also go in this kind of strategy. As I said, they go in most decks, so this will probably be a slide in every single possible text in like every deck. Now, some of the other possible techs. Baron Geddon and Alexstrasza. Now, Alexstrasza functions as a way of getting your opponent down to 15 so they can never take a hit from one of your win conditions. Ever. If they don't deal with Alexstrasza, then they are down to 7. And if you already had a legendary on the board when you play Alexstrasza, they are probably dead if they can't deal with both of them the next turn. It's an incredibly powerful nuke down ability. You can also heal yourself up in a pinch, but most of the time you're going to be armoring up, so getting low is a bit sketchy. However, it is definitely possible. Now, the other one here is Baron Geddon. Baron Geddon is a very underestimated legendary, but if you think about it, it does everything the deck wants it to do. It functions as a Big Game Hunter target instead of Ragnaros or Alexstrasza or some of the other win conditions it can play. It deals with all the small stuff that you really don't want to invest cards in. It's a clock, and it deals 7 damage a turn, which means they can't ignore it. It's a win condition in sort of a lesser degree, but it is still a win condition and will still deal a lot of damage, and they still have to deal with it. So, Baron Geddon, while not played in a lot of decks, if you're playing it in a deck with this many legendaries, it gets to the point where they have to just kill every single minion you play. If you play Baron Geddon towards the end of the game, they're out of removal. Usually, playing this deck with so many win conditions, the first couple win conditions will be dealt with. Once you get to the 4th, 5th win condition, your opponent can't remove them. And Baron Geddon is one of those win conditions, which is just a clock, and it's very difficult for them to remove with minions, so they have to go for spell removal, but they've often used all of it on some of the larger stuff. Now, the last 2 techs I'm going to talk about are 2 of the other dragons you can play. Ysera and Onyxia. Now, between Ysera, Onyxia, and Alexstrasza, you want to play probably 2 of them. I would not play all 3, but I would definitely play 2 of them, and it's debatable what you play. I would recommend playing Ysera with either Onyxia or Alexstrasza, But anyway, Ysera I already talked about earlier. It's just a win condition and very difficult to remove because you need to Tinkmaster it or Hex it or something. You can't Big Game Hunter it. And it has 12 life, so you're not bursting that down. It's just an incredible win condition and will slowly grind your opponent out. If you get a couple Ysera Awakens, it's just game over. Emo Drakes is pretty large to the point when, I mean, if a token creature can be Big Game Huntered, then it will definitely pose a threat. Laughing Sister is a bit weird, but can sometimes grind your opponent out. Most of the Dream cards are very powerful. Onyxia is a bit of an interesting one. It sort of functions as a similar role to Alexstrasza. Well, Alexstrasza has a battle cry that nukes your opponent down. Onyxia has sort of a delayed reaction, where it gives you 14 attack if you get a full Onyxia, and it's very difficult to deal with in one card, or even a couple cards. So it gives you 14 attack. So if they're on lower life, if you have more burst damage and you're finding that you don't need to lower that life down to 15 with Alexstrasza, play Onyxia. Onyxia, if they're on 20 life or something, Onyxia is lethal. It will get him for 14 a turn, and then you've got things like Ragnaros and Grom, and it's just ridiculous the amount of damage Onyxia will do at times. However, Alexstrasza can be a bit more consistent than Onyxia. Onyxia has more explosive potential in this kind of deck, but Alexstrasza is definitely more consistent. I would say, however, that the best of the three dragons is Ysera, and then I would decide whether you want to play Onyxia or Alexstrasza. I've seen versions that play both. So anyway, thank you all for watching. That's the end of my 1,000 subscriber sort of reel that I did. I did the patch review and then all the deck techs and everything. So I'm going to be going back to normal as far as video scheduling goes. I've got the weekly show coming up on Saturday, and then I've got the tournament recaps coming out on Tuesday, and then I've got my articles going up on Hearthstone on Fridays. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. If you want to come chat to me, come on to the Mana Grind Teamspeak. I'm usually hanging around in the afternoons and evenings as far as Europe time goes. But this has been Jotto, signing off.